You are standing at the edge of the Pacific, where the air never quite rests. Salt hangs in the wind. The deck beneath your feet vibrates faintly as engines cough awake before dawn. The horizon is wide, but never empty, a pale line where sea and sky meet without promise. Somewhere above this water, a single aircraft lifts into the light, fragile by design, stubborn by necessity. Its outline is compact, almost modest, carrying no suggestion of dominance. The machine was never meant to impress. It was meant to endure. Before you drift off, take a quiet moment to subscribe, but only if stories told without spectacle are your kind of thing. If you'd like, let us know where you're listening from tonight, or which part of the story you're settling into. You're listening to Echoes of War. Jefferson Joseph DeBlanc moves through this space without ceremony. He is young, steady, shaped by discipline rather than ambition. He carries himself with the quiet assurance of someone used to responsibility, not recognition. His confidence is not loud. It does not announce itself. It shows in how he checks equipment twice, how he waits without restlessness, how he accepts routine without complaint. He is a Marine pilot in a war that leaves little room for individuality. One aircraft among many. One name among countless others recorded and forgotten. What matters here is not who he will become, but who he is now. A man preparing to fly because it is required of him, not because the sky promises distinction. Men move across the deck with practiced economy. There is no spectacle here, no sense of occasion. Gear is checked, straps pulled tight, hands resting on metal that has already been touched too many times to feel unfamiliar. These movements no longer belong to thought. They belong to habit. Inside the cockpit, space disappears. The instruments are simple. The margins are thin. There is no room for error, and no promise of return. Once the canopy closes, the world narrows to vibration, wind, and the steady insistence of the engine. Everything unnecessary is left behind. This story does not begin with victory. It does not begin with numbers, or rank, or reputation. It begins with repetition, with the choice to climb again, knowing that each ascent carries the same risks as the last, with the understanding that experience does not remove danger. It only teaches how to live beside it. Out here, courage is quiet. It looks like restraint. It sounds like an engine held within limits. The Pacific stretches beneath the aircraft, indifferent and unmarked. Distance is measured in fuel and minutes, not miles. There are no landmarks to offer reassurance. A mistake does not mean retreat. It means vanishing into water that keeps no memory. Up here, danger rarely arrives as drama. It accumulates. Heat builds slowly inside the cockpit. Sunlight flattens the sky into glare. Time stretches and thins. Eyes scan without rest, trained to notice absence as much as movement. The body learns how to stay alert without tension, how to wait without drifting. The aircraft responds best to calm hands. It forgives nothing done in haste. Other machines climb faster, turn tighter, strike harder. This one survives by staying intact long enough to leave. It rewards pilots who understand that survival is not found in aggression, but in patience, in knowing when not to press an advantage. Below, the ocean moves as it always has. It has seen aircraft fall before. It will see them again. The sky offers no protection, only space. What happens within it depends entirely on seconds, angles, decisions made without reflection. Hours pass with nothing to mark them. The engine settles into a steady rhythm. Muscles relax without slackening. The mind stays narrow and disciplined, holding itself inside procedure. Flying becomes work done above water, familiar, demanding, and never fully safe. When contact comes, if it comes, there will be no announcement. No time to prepare emotionally. Training will take over where thought cannot. Instinct will carry what reason no longer has time to manage. But for now, there is only waiting. This is how danger becomes ordinary, not through bravado, but through routine, through days that resemble one another closely enough to blur together, through the quiet belief that experience creates distance from chance, a belief that keeps the cockpit steady, even when it is only partially true. Somewhere in this wide sky, a pilot continues the work. No tally is being kept. No distinction is being claimed. The moment does not feel historic. It feels familiar. Tonight, you are not watching a battle. You are keeping company. Keeping company with a man who learned how to stay alive in a machine never meant to forgive mistakes. A man shaped not by a single moment, but by accumulation, by returning again and again to a sky that never softened. This story begins here, between departure and return, where survival is built quietly, flight by flight. The Pacific is waiting. Before the Pacific became routine, before flight hours stacked quietly into muscle memory, there was ground, solid, predictable, forgiving in ways the sky never would be. Training did not begin with danger. It began with order. Days followed a rhythm that left little space for improvisation. Wake, brief, drill, review. Time was divided cleanly, measured and accounted for. There was comfort in that structure, in knowing where to be, what was expected, and when the day would end. The future arrived in scheduled blocks. On the ground, mistakes still belonged to learning. An error could be traced back, examined, corrected. A poor decision did not yet carry irreversible weight. Instructors intervened early, voices calm but firm, shaping judgment before it hardened into habit. Airfields felt contained. Their boundaries were visible, their risks legible. Runways ended where expected. Equipment failed in ways that could be anticipated. When something went wrong, it happened within reach of help. There was always someone watching. This environment shaped confidence without urgency. The belief took hold, quietly, that preparation created margin, that discipline could make uncertainty manageable. Not eliminate it, but hold it at arm's length. Flight training broke the sky into components: altitude, airspeed, climb rate, fuel burn. Nothing mystical, nothing symbolic. Each variable could be named, adjusted, brought back into tolerance. Mastery felt procedural. Early flights rewarded smoothness over ambition. Landings were evaluated not by drama, but by absence of correction. The highest compliment was that nothing needed to be said. Progress was measured in how little attention was drawn. Repetition did its work. The body learned sequences before the mind questioned them. Hands found controls without searching. Feet adjusted pressure instinctively. The aircraft responded, predictably, reinforcing the sense that understanding created safety. There was pride in getting it right, in bringing the aircraft back unmarked, in following procedure closely enough that the flight left no story behind. The language of training praised consistency, restraint, control. Long before combat entered the picture, a preference was already forming. Survive first, perform second. On the ground, these lessons carried no urgency. They felt preparatory, abstract. The sky had not yet begun to push back. The aircraft itself did not arrive as a symbol. It arrived as a responsibility. It had weight, resistance, a presence that demanded attention even when stationary. Pre-flight inspections were slow, methodical, almost meditative, hands moving along surfaces, eyes tracing seams, looking for small signs of future failure. The Wildcat did not invite affection. It invited understanding. In the air, it revealed its character gradually. Controls were firm, not eager. The aircraft resisted sudden movement, punishing rough handling with instability. It asked for anticipation rather than reaction, calm rather than force. Training flights became conversations conducted without words. Each maneuver taught something about balance, about what the aircraft tolerated and what it refused. Speed bled away faster than expected in turns. Recovery required patience, not panic. The Wildcat did not hide its limits. It made them obvious, and in doing so, it shaped the pilot toward restraint. Other aircraft promised dominance through speed or agility. This one promised endurance, if treated correctly. Armor was placed where it mattered. Structure was built to absorb punishment. The design assumed damage and planned for survival rather than perfection. That assumption mattered. It taught a particular kind of discipline, not to press an advantage too far, not to chase unnecessarily, not to confuse aggression with effectiveness. Survival here was not passive, it was deliberate. Each flight ended the same way. The aircraft returned. The engine wound down. Heat lifted slowly from metal. Inspections followed. Notes were made. Lessons carried forward. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was the point. By the time confidence settled in, it was no longer loud. It felt practical, measured, paired with an understanding that safety was conditional, temporary, dependent on continuous restraint. The ground still existed. The margins were still wide. The lessons still felt theoretical. The sky, for now, remained cooperative. When the Wildcat left the relative calm of training airspace and entered operational skies, it did not change its nature. It did not become faster, or lighter, or more forgiving. What changed was the context around it. Out here, the aircraft was no longer a learning tool. It was a boundary. The Pacific demanded distance. Patrols stretched longer. The water below offered no alternative if something failed. Every decision carried the quiet knowledge that there was nowhere to land, nowhere to pause, nowhere to wait for help. In this environment, the Wildcat's design revealed its intention. It was not built to dominate the sky through speed or elegance. It was built to stay together under strain. Armor protected the pilot where it mattered. Structure absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter machines. Systems were simple, accessible, and reparable. The aircraft carried weight willingly. It accepted that weight as the price of survival. From the cockpit, the Wildcat felt solid, not responsive in a way that encouraged risk, but dependable in a way that rewarded caution. It did not tempt the pilot into reckless maneuvers. It insisted on being flown within limits, limits that now mattered more than ever. This was an aircraft designed for men who would have to come back through weather, fatigue, and damage. It assumed imperfect conditions. It assumed mistakes. And it built margin where it could. That margin was not generous. It was just enough. In operational skies, that difference mattered. When engines overheated, when controls stiffened, when the aircraft returned scarred and leaking, the Wildcat often still flew. It did not hide damage. It carried it openly, forcing its pilot to acknowledge every vibration, every imbalance, every change in response. The Wildcat did not promise victory. It promised time. time to disengage, time to descend, time to reach water or deck before failure finished its work. In a war fought across vast distances, time was often the only resource left. Combat did not reward those who flew the wildcat as if it were something else. Against faster, more agile opponents, the temptation to chase could be fatal. The aircraft did not turn sharply enough, did not climb quickly enough, did not accelerate cleanly enough to recover from overcommitment. Every aggressive decision had to be weighed against the cost of being wrong. This shaped a particular style of flying. Patience replaced pursuit. Position mattered more than speed. Pilots learned to fight defensively, to preserve energy, to wait for moments that offered advantage rather than forcing them into existence. The sky became a place of calculation rather than impulse. The Wildcat taught its pilots to respect geometry, to understand angles, separation, timing, to trust teamwork over individual action. Survival often depended on flying with others, covering blind spots, creating space to disengage. There was no room for solo bravado. The aircraft's limitations made every engagement feel narrow. Opportunities appeared briefly and vanished just as quickly. Hesitation could be as dangerous as aggression. The margin for error remained thin, but now it was shared between machine and pilot. Flying inside those limits required discipline under pressure. It demanded restraint at moments when instinct urged pursuit. It required accepting that not every encounter could be pressed, that survival sometimes meant leaving without confirmation. This was not defeat. It was continuity. Each return reinforced the same lesson. The Wildcat did not forgive impatience, but it rewarded judgment. Pilots who treated the aircraft as a partner rather than a weapon found themselves returning more often, sometimes damaged, sometimes shaken, but still airborne. Over time, this approach became instinctive. Decisions compressed. Risk was evaluated without conscious thought. The aircraft and pilot settled into a shared rhythm, cautious, deliberate, effective. This was how the Wildcat was meant to be flown. Not loudly, not heroically, but correctly. In the Pacific, correctness mattered more than dominance. It was what allowed the work to continue. The Pacific does not confront. It separates. By the time Jefferson DeBlanc begins encountering enemy aircraft regularly, flying has already lost its sense of occasion. From altitude, the water offers no variation, no roads, no borders, no markers of progress. Just movement layered over depth, repeating without reference. Once airborne, the sense of distance changes. There is no middle ground between departure and return. Only continuation. Flights lengthen. The horizon stays fixed while time moves around it. Fuel becomes a constant calculation, not an emergency, but a quiet presence in the mind. Every adjustment is measured against endurance rather than urgency. The cockpit grows warmer as hours pass. Air circulates poorly. Sweat dries and returns. The engine settles into a rhythm that is both reassuring and relentless. There is no silence here, only the steady insistence of motion. Below, the water absorbs everything without response. Weather moves differently in this part of the world. Clouds form suddenly, thick and vertical, obscuring space without warning. Light shifts rapidly, flattening depth, erasing contrast. The sky can appear empty and crowded at the same time, offering too much visibility and not enough. Navigation demands attention. A small error compounds quickly when there are no landmarks to correct against. Position is maintained through calculation, not recognition. The margin for drift exists long before it is felt. The Pacific does not punish mistakes immediately. It allows them to accumulate. Fatigue sets in subtly. Muscles remain still for long periods, tension held without release. Eyes strain against glare and repetition. The mind narrows, focusing on routine to avoid wandering. Alertness becomes something that must be maintained actively, like altitude. In this environment, waiting becomes its own discipline. Contact is rare. Hours pass without sight of another aircraft. When something does appear, it often dissolves into cloud or distance before identity can be confirmed. Each false alarm leaves a residue, a brief spike of attention followed by return to restraint. The absence of action begins to shape expectation. The sky teaches patience through monotony. It trains pilots to remain ready without urgency, to conserve energy for moments that may never arrive. Yet the possibility remains. Every flight carries the same quiet understanding. If something goes wrong, it will happen far from help. There will be no correction from the ground, no second attempt. Only decisions made inside a narrowing window. The aircraft continues to perform, but the cost of each hour is felt. Fuel diminishes. Heat builds. The body stiffens. Small mechanical irregularities become noticeable. Vibrations slightly off. Responses marginally slower. Nothing critical. Just reminders. The Pacific keeps no schedule. It does not escalate in predictable ways. Pressure builds not through intensity, but through duration. The longer the flight, the more the sky feels inhabited, not by enemies, but by absence. A sense that space itself is watching, waiting for inattention. Returning to base brings no release. There is relief, yes, but also repetition. The next flight follows soon after. There is little time to mark one patrol as distinct from another. Days blur. Hours stack. This is where normalization begins. Danger has not yet appeared, but its conditions are already present. The environment has done its work quietly, shaping behavior, compressing margins, teaching the body how to remain inside long stretches of uncertainty. By the time combat arrives, it will not feel sudden. It will feel like a continuation. The Pacific has already narrowed the space. The sky has already set the terms. By the time combat entered his days, flying no longer felt episodic. There was no internal shift when the aircraft lifted into operational airspace. The body accepted altitude as it always had. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm. The sky opened without promise or warning. What mattered was attention, held evenly, without anticipation. Recognition came before emotion. A shape where there should have been none. A line that did not belong to cloud. A movement that disrupted the stillness just enough to demand focus. The eyes stayed on it longer than instinct wanted. Not long enough to speculate, only long enough to confirm. The aircraft remained steady. Hands resisted the urge to correct too early. Distance mattered more than reaction. Combat, when it arrived, did so quietly. The first moments were defined by separation, not violence. Altitude was compared. Position adjusted. The sun was accounted for. The ocean beneath became suddenly relevant, not as scenery, but as consequence. The sky reorganized itself around geometry. Speed was conserved deliberately. The wildcat did not reward haste. Every correction bled energy that might not be recovered. Control inputs remained small, restrained, calculated to preserve margin rather than seize advantage. When engagement followed, it unfolded without spectacle. Convergence, divergence. a brief compression of space. Noise increased, vibration sharpened, but the aircraft remained honest. It responded exactly as it always had. The moment passed quickly. Distance returned. The sky loosened again. The engine tone steadied. The aircraft continued forward as if nothing had happened. What remained was confirmation. Not that the enemy had been engaged, but that the system held. That procedures survived pressure. That survival could be achieved without excess. That mattered more than outcome. The second encounter did not feel different from the first. Neither did the third. Some flights ended without contact at all. Others carried brief moments of compression that resolved without conclusion. Enemy aircraft appeared, disappeared, reappeared at angles that resisted engagement. Not every sighting led to action. Not every action led to resolution. The sky did not reward effort with clarity. Repetition did its work quietly. Encounters stopped standing out. They became variations of the same demand: recognize, assess, conserve, disengage if necessary. The wildcat enforced this rhythm relentlessly. Any attempt to force outcome was punished immediately, either through loss of position or increased vulnerability. Flying became less about reacting and more about refusing. Refusing to chase. Refusing to overcommit. Refusing to mistake proximity for advantage. Some engagements resolved quickly. Others stretched into minutes that felt longer than entire patrols. In each case, the decision-making process remained narrow. There was no space for reflection, only evaluation and response. The body adapted. Movements grew smaller. Inputs became anticipatory rather than corrective. The eyes learned where to rest, how to scan without searching. The sound of the engine receded again, even when tension returned to the sky. Fear did not disappear. It compressed. It lived alongside task, sharpening focus without overwhelming it. Panic had no use here. The environment eliminated it efficiently. After encounters, there was little to say. Aircraft were inspected. Damage noted. Fuel logged. Words exchanged only where necessary. The sky did not encourage storytelling. It required readiness. Some days brought multiple contacts. Others brought none. The unpredictability did not heighten anxiety. It normalized vigilance. Readiness became a condition rather than a response. Over time, something subtle occurred. Encounters that would once have demanded full attention now passed through the body almost without remark. Decisions that once required conscious effort arrived intact, complete, unquestioned. The aircraft and pilot moved together inside narrowing margins without conflict. This was not confidence. It was familiarity. The Pacific had already taught waiting. Combat now taught continuity. Flights stacked. Days blurred. Patrols merged. The distinction between routine and engagement dissolved. What mattered was not what happened during a flight, but that the aircraft returned intact and the work continued. No one stopped to count in the air. Outcomes accumulated elsewhere, on the ground, removed from heat and vibration. In the cockpit, there was only the present, a sky that might compress at any moment, and a machine that demanded restraint regardless. This was how combat became ordinary, not because it lost danger, but because danger stopped interrupting life and instead became its background condition. The sky accepted this arrangement without comment. Each return followed the same arc: descent, landing, engine winding down. Heat lifted from metal. Salt dried on skin. The body prepared itself, without discussion, to do it again. There was no day that declared itself as important. Flights continued to begin the same way. Engines warmed. The aircraft lifted. The Pacific opened beneath the wings, vast and unreceptive. Nothing in the sky suggested that anything was changing, let alone building. And yet, something was. The accumulation did not announce itself through escalation. It emerged through sameness, through a growing familiarity with conditions that once required conscious effort. Each flight resembled the last closely enough that distinctions blurred. Patrols overlapped in memory. Encounters slipped out of sequence. Combat did not arrive as a series of events. It arrived as a condition. Some days brought a single contact. Others brought several. Many brought none at all. The unpredictability no longer felt dramatic. It felt structural. Readiness had to be maintained regardless of outcome. The sky rarely offered clean resolution. Contacts often appeared at distances that resisted engagement. Aircraft crossed paths without converging. Opportunities presented themselves briefly, then collapsed under changing geometry or fuel constraint. Separation returned before anything could be confirmed. These non-events became as instructive as combat itself. They taught restraint through denial. They reinforced the reality that not every situation could, or should, be resolved. The wildcat enforced this truth mercilessly. Any attempt to force outcome bled speed and position too quickly to be recovered. Flying became an exercise in refusal. Refusal to chase an aircraft that could not be caught. Refusal to turn tighter than energy allowed. Refusal to believe that proximity equaled advantage. This refusal was not passive. It required discipline under pressure, the kind that runs counter to instinct. Every engagement demanded judgment not just about what could be done, but about what should be left undone. With time, this judgment sharpened. The body learned the aircraft's limits more precisely than any manual could teach. The wildcat spoke through resistance, through sluggish response when pushed too far, through subtle vibration when energy margins thinned. These signals were felt rather than interpreted. Hands adjusted earlier now. Corrections happened before instability emerged. Turns were initiated with foresight rather than reaction. Altitude was guarded instinctively, treated as reserve rather than asset. What once required calculation now happened automatically. Encounters began to resolve themselves before they fully formed. Angles were anticipated. Separation was chosen deliberately. The aircraft and pilot moved together inside narrowing margins without conflict or hesitation. This did not feel like confidence. It felt like familiarity stripped of illusion. The Pacific continued to demand patience. Hours passed with nothing to show for vigilance. The sky remained empty until it wasn't, and then empty again. The rhythm never changed. Over time, even combat lost its ability to stand out, not because it became safe, but because it stopped interrupting the flow of days. Engagements folded into patrols the way weather folded into flight planning, as variables to be managed, not moments to be remembered. There was no sense of progress, no internal tally kept, no milestones marked, no moment when experience was acknowledged as such. The work was to remain effective, to continue returning, to preserve the aircraft and the pilot long enough for the next flight to occur. This effectiveness left little trace. The Pacific absorbed each flight without distinction. It did not reward success with clarity. It offered only continuation. Accumulation happened anyway. Recognition did not enter the cockpit. It arrived elsewhere, after the engine wound down, after the aircraft was secured, after the body had stepped back onto solid ground. It came through language that did not attempt to recreate the conditions under which decisions had been made. Reports were read. Numbers were confirmed. Outcomes were aligned with records kept beyond the sky. Only then did a pattern become visible. What had felt like isolated fragments, brief convergences, partial engagements, incomplete resolutions, were now assembled into a sequence. The accumulation that had gone unnoticed in the air was rendered legible on paper. The word itself carried no weight aloft. It did not alter how the aircraft flew. It did not change how the Pacific behaved. In the cockpit, nothing shifted. If anything, awareness sharpened restraint further. Recognition did not create ease. It underscored fragility. Experience had already demonstrated how quickly advantage dissolved under fatigue, weather, or misjudgment. The wildcat remained unchanged, heavy, unforgiving, indifferent to outcome. It demanded the same discipline it always had. It punished the same errors. It offered no margin in exchange for reputation. Flying continued as it always had, measured, procedural, incomplete. On the ground, distinction could be named. In the air, it meant nothing. The aircraft did not respond differently because of it. The sky did not offer more space. The Pacific did not soften. The next patrol remained exactly as demanding as the last. What defined effectiveness here was never the tally itself. It was the consistency that produced it. The ability to repeat correct judgment across fatigue, repetition, and uncertainty without escalation. This form of distinction resisted drama. It did not seek acknowledgement. It did not invite reflection. It existed independently of awareness, a byproduct of restraint maintained long enough to be counted later. By the time it could be recognized externally, it had already been internalized. It no longer felt like achievement. It felt like condition, something that had formed gradually, without announcement, and now simply existed. The Pacific continued its movement without interruption. The sky remained wide and indifferent. Accumulation continued, unnoticed in the moment, irreversible only in hindsight, not as a story, but as weight. Nothing about the Pacific changed its appearance. The water remained wide and unbroken. The sky continued to offer the same pale distance. The aircraft lifted and leveled as it always had. From the outside, the pattern held. What changed was internal. Flights lengthened in ways that could not be shortened. Patrol areas expanded incrementally, just enough to stretch endurance without announcing themselves as excessive. Fuel calculations grew tighter. Time aloft pressed against margins that once felt generous. The body noticed before the mind acknowledged. Muscles held tension for hours without release. Shoulders stiffened. Hands remained fixed in position, gripping controls that demanded constant pressure but offered little variation. The cockpit trapped heat, allowing it to build without circulation. Sweat formed, dried, returned. Hydration became something to be managed carefully, rationed against duration. Hunger arrived quietly, then stayed. Sleep between sorties shortened, fractured by noise, routine, and anticipation. None of this felt dramatic. It felt continuous. The aircraft continued to respond, but its responses carried more information now. Vibrations that once faded into background demanded attention. The engine's rhythm was listened to closely, not out of alarm, but necessity. Small changes in pitch or resistance were noted and catalogued. The wildcat did not fail outright. It hinted. The body learned to listen the same way. Eyes strained against glare that flattened depth and erased contrast. Scanning became effortful. Blinks were timed. Focus narrowed deliberately to avoid exhaustion. The mind learned how to stay alert without expanding outward. Fatigue did not announce itself as weakness. It arrived as narrowing. Movements took slightly longer to initiate. Corrections required marginally more effort. Decisions still arrived intact, but they demanded confirmation where none had been needed before. The body compensated instinctively. Posture shifted. Grip adjusted. Breathing slowed. Attention compressed further, trimmed to essentials. Anything unnecessary was dropped. This adaptation worked, for a time. The Pacific did not require catastrophe. It waited for accumulation to reach a point where correction no longer held. Microfailures began to appear, not as mistakes, but as moments where recovery demanded more than it should have. A turn completed later than expected. Altitude lost and regained with effort. Speed bled more quickly than anticipated. None of these moments were decisive. Each resolved, but each left residue. The margin between recognition and response narrowed until it barely existed. Where once there had been time to assess and choose, now there was only execution. Decisions arrived without deliberation, intact but compressed. The aircraft still flew correctly, but with less tolerance for deviation. Weather compounded the strain. Clouds rose abruptly, forcing altitude changes that consumed fuel and energy. Light shifted without warning, flattening the sky into uniform brightness that resisted depth perception. Navigation required constant attention. Small drift accumulated quickly when not corrected immediately. The Pacific allowed error to grow quietly. Fatigue deepened. Sleep no longer restored fully. Recovery remained partial. The body carried forward yesterday's strain into today's flight. Muscles remembered tension before the aircraft even lifted. The wildcat endured, but endurance was not infinite. Systems continued to function, but their margin mirrored the pilot's. Both required precise handling now. Neither tolerated improvisation. Encounters with enemy aircraft continued, but they no longer defined the flight. They arrived layered on top of fatigue, weather, distance, and time. Each additional demand compressed space further. The work became heavier, not because it changed, but because it had to be sustained without relief. Microfailures corrected themselves, until one did not. There was no single moment that marked the shift. Only the growing sense that recovery now consumed nearly all available margin. That decisions still arrived, but left little space behind them. The Pacific did not hurry this process. It allowed it to complete itself. By the time the margin thinned enough to be felt clearly, there was nowhere to step back into. The work continued because it had to. The aircraft flew because it could. But endurance had begun to cost more than it could replenish. The sky did not need to overpower. It only needed to persist. The closing in was complete, not as threat, but as condition. It does not begin with violence. The aircraft lifts as it always has. The engine settles into its familiar tone. The sky offers no warning, no signal that this flight will separate itself from the others. Nothing feels out of sequence. And yet, the margin is already thin. Fatigue is present before takeoff, carried forward from days that never fully reset. Muscles hold tension automatically now. Attention narrows immediately, not by choice, but by necessity. The body enters the work already drawing on reserve. The Pacific opens beneath the wings, unchanged. The first sign is not dramatic. It is a resistance that feels slightly wrong, a response that arrives a fraction late. The aircraft still obeys, but not with its usual honesty. Something in the chain between intention and movement has lengthened. The engine continues to run. The aircraft continues to fly. Nothing has failed outright. This is what makes it dangerous. The mind searches briefly for explanation, then releases it. There is no time for speculation. Training asserts itself, narrowing focus to what can be measured. Airspeed, altitude, engine tone. Each parameter is checked and rechecked. The Wildcat is kept inside its limits deliberately, flown conservatively to preserve what margin remains. Then the resistance increases. Control inputs require more effort. Balance feels uneven. Corrections consume more altitude than expected. The aircraft does not respond cleanly to trim. It remains airborne, but only through constant attention. The sky tightens. There is still order, still discipline, still procedure, but the effort required to maintain them grows. Fuel calculations compress inward. Time becomes expensive. Options that once existed on the periphery disappear. There is no longer space to wait for conditions to improve. The Pacific remains indifferent. The failure continues to announce itself incrementally. Power diminishes unevenly. Vibrations sharpen, then smooth, then sharpen again. The engine's rhythm fractures just enough to demand continuous monitoring. This is not collapse. It is erosion. Training insists on control, and control is maintained, but only just. Every correction leaves less margin behind it. Recovery now costs more than it restores. The body recognizes the pattern before the mind names it. This is not a situation that resolves. The aircraft has absorbed everything it can. Fatigue, damage, strain, all carried forward across countless hours. Now it signals clearly, without drama, that it cannot continue indefinitely. Decision arrives without urgency, but with finality. Stay with the machine or leave it. Attempt distance or preserve altitude. Delay and risk loss of control, or act while choice remains. There is no panic. There is clarity. The Wildcat has done its work. It has endured long enough to offer this moment, the last one in which decision still belongs to the pilot. The sky offers no guidance. The ocean waits below, unchanged. The choice is made not in haste, but in acceptance. Leaving the aircraft is not dramatic. It is mechanical. Hands move through sequence without conscious thought. The body performs actions it has rehearsed but never expected to enact. The canopy opens. Wind floods the cockpit. Noise overwhelms everything else. The aircraft falls away. For a moment, there is no reference. No orientation, only force. The body accelerates faster than the mind can follow. Air tears at clothing. Sound collapses into pressure. The sky that once felt expansive compresses into motion without direction. Then there is separation. The parachute deploys, violently and completely. The force snaps the body upright, replacing speed with suspension. The noise recedes. The descent slows into something manageable. The world returns in fragments. Sky above. Water below. The aircraft gone. There is time now, but it feels unfamiliar. Seconds stretch. The body hangs between altitude and impact, aware of both without being able to alter either. The Pacific rises steadily. Impact is not cushioned. It is absorbed. Cold replaces heat instantly. Water fills space that air once occupied. The body is dragged downward by weight and inertia. Instinct overrides everything else. Release. Surface. Breathe. The ocean asserts itself immediately, rolling, pulling, refusing stillness. The parachute disappears. The aircraft is nowhere to be seen. There is no time to watch for it. What remains is survival at water level. The body reacts in fragments. Muscles cramp. Breath comes shallow at first, then steadies. Pain announces itself slowly, filtered through shock. The mind inventories function without emotion, limbs, movement, awareness. There is no rescue yet. No certainty that one is coming. The Pacific stretches outward in every direction, offering no scale, no reference. The sky above feels impossibly distant now, as though belonging to a different life entirely. The descent is complete. Control has ended. Endurance remains. Everything that once defined the work, altitude, speed, formation, dissolves. What matters now is staying afloat, staying conscious, staying alive long enough for time to change shape again. The ocean does not close this chapter. It opens the next one. It absorbs, resists, presses back. After the sky, it feels dense, heavy with texture and consequence. Movement is slower here, deliberate in ways that flight never was. Every action costs more effort than expected. The body learns this immediately. Clothing clings with water and salt. Muscles tighten against cold and strain. Balance feels uncertain, unfamiliar without the reference of horizon and instrument. The air smells different, damp, vegetal, closed in. Sound carries unevenly, swallowed by distance or reflected without warning. There is no sense of position, only presence. Survival becomes local, immediate. The wide calculations of flight collapse into narrow concerns: concealment, movement, stillness. The ground offers cover, but only if understood. Every step leaves trace. Every pause invites exposure. Pain settles in now, no longer delayed by urgency. It arrives without drama, catalogued and set aside. There is no room to dwell on it. The body is still required to function. Time stretches again, but differently. In the air, waiting was expansive, filled with repetition. On the ground, it tightens. Each minute demands attention. Stillness must be chosen carefully. Motion must justify itself. The sky remains above, but it no longer belongs to the pilot. Aircraft pass without recognition. Engines fade into distance, reminders of a world that continues without pause. There is no signal to send, no formation to rejoin. Identity narrows. What once defined purpose, altitude, speed, coordination, no longer applies. Survival becomes the only measure that matters. Everything else is postponed indefinitely. The ground teaches quickly. It punishes noise, rewards patience, conceals and reveals unpredictably. Familiar skills offer little advantage here. What worked in the sky does not translate cleanly. Judgment must be rebuilt from scratch. This is not a place of movement. It is a place of endurance. The moment of capture does not arrive as confrontation. It emerges quietly, through realization rather than force. A sound out of place. A presence felt before it is seen. The narrowing of options until none remain that do not invite greater harm. There is no final maneuver. The body understands before the mind does. Stillness replaces motion. Resistance is weighed and discarded. Survival shifts again, changing shape without ceremony. The transition is subtle, but absolute. Weapons are removed. Equipment disappears. Hands are guided, not roughly, but firmly enough to leave no doubt. The world reduces to proximity, footsteps nearby, voices indistinct, the pressure of being watched. The war slows. Movement becomes permitted rather than chosen. Direction is no longer decided internally. Time fragments, breaking into intervals marked by instruction and waiting. What remains is awareness. Observation turns inward. The mind inventories what it can still control: breath, posture, response. The discipline learned in the air finds new use here, stripped of machinery and altitude, but intact in habit. Fear does not vanish. It becomes diffuse. Unattached to immediate threat, it spreads into uncertainty, into not knowing what will follow or how long it will last. The sky is gone now. The Pacific too. In their place is enclosure, physical, psychological, temporal. Space contracts. The horizon disappears entirely. This is where the story pauses its forward motion, not because it ends, but because it must wait. The work has changed again. Survival is no longer about movement or decision. It is about endurance under observation. The ground has taken its hold. Time does not pass here in a straight line. It accumulates. There is no clear beginning to a day, and no reliable signal of its end. Light arrives indirectly, filtered and incomplete. Darkness follows without ceremony. The body learns to mark time by hunger, by fatigue, by the rhythm of being allowed to move. Motion is rationed. Each movement is permitted rather than chosen. Standing, sitting, walking, all occur within limits set by others. Space contracts to the immediate. A few steps become a journey. A corner becomes an edge not to be crossed. The world reduces itself. Sounds arrive unpredictably. Sometimes there is long silence, so complete it feels heavy. Other times noise intrudes abruptly. Voices, metal, footsteps, none of them offering information, all of them demanding attention. The body learns to remain still inside both. Sleep fragments. It comes in shallow intervals, easily broken. Dreams, when they arrive, are vivid and brief, dissolving on waking without resolution. The mind struggles to place itself in time, to decide whether rest has occurred at all. Hunger settles into routine. It is no longer urgent, only constant. The body adjusts, drawing less from muscle, more from patience. Energy becomes something to be preserved deliberately. Movements are minimized. Breathing slows. The war continues elsewhere. This is understood intellectually, but it has no relevance here. Aircraft still fly. Decisions are still made. Battles still unfold beyond reach. None of that movement enters this space. Captivity exists beside the war, not inside it. Here, nothing advances. Endurance replaces action. The effort required is not physical, but internal. The effort to remain oriented, to maintain restraint, to prevent the mind from racing ahead into outcomes that cannot yet be shaped. Routine becomes shelter. Small habits form quietly. Mental counting. Repeated sequences of movement. attention directed deliberately to breath or posture. These patterns provide structure where none is offered. They anchor identity in the absence of agency. This is not passivity. It is control redirected inward. The body remains confined, but discipline survives. The same restraint that once conserved fuel and altitude now conserves something less visible: coherence. Captivity strips identity down to essentials. There is no role to perform, no equipment to manage, no environment to master. What remains is presence, the ability to stay intact inside conditions that offer no feedback. The habits learned in the air return quietly. Attention remains narrow. Reaction is delayed. Energy is rationed. The instinct to conserve margin persists, even when margin no longer exists in physical form. Discipline, stripped of machinery, becomes psychological. Memory becomes both refuge and hazard. Certain recollections arrive uninvited: the sound of the engine settling into cruise, the sensation of altitude stabilizing, the horizon widening beneath the wings. These memories offer momentary relief, but too much immersion risks disorientation. The mind learns to touch memory lightly, without entering it fully. Conversation, when it occurs, is careful. Words are chosen for survival, not expression. Silence becomes valuable. Listening matters more than speaking. Information is stored without visible response. Time stretches. Days lose distinction. Weeks dissolve into sameness. Without markers, duration becomes abstract. The body feels the passage of time more than the mind understands it. Fear changes shape again. It is no longer sharp or immediate. It becomes ambient, present without focus, difficult to exhaust. The challenge is not to eliminate it, but to prevent it from filling available space. This requires discipline. Posture is maintained deliberately. Breath is regulated. The mind is kept close to the present, avoiding projection forward or backward. Both directions carry risk. The self becomes something actively preserved, not through resistance, but through containment, through refusal to unravel internally when nothing external can be controlled, through acceptance without surrender. This is the deepest form of endurance, not the endurance of effort, but of restraint, of holding order inside uncertainty, of remaining internally aligned when all external structure belongs to someone else. The war outside continues to move. Inside captivity, stillness reigns, yet something remains intact. The discipline that once kept an aircraft inside its limits now keeps a man inside himself, not hardened, not broken, simply waiting. Waiting without knowing when or how the shape of the war will change again. Release does not arrive as a moment. There is no clear line to step across, no signal that one condition has ended and another has begun. Captivity loosens its grip gradually, uncertain of its own disappearance. Restrictions ease unevenly. Instructions change. Movement becomes less supervised, but not yet free. The body responds first. Muscles move with unfamiliar ease. Steps lengthen. Space expands without immediately offering direction. The return of choice feels abstract, almost theoretical, after so long without it. The mind lags behind. What has happened elsewhere during captivity cannot be taken in all at once. Time compresses backward, attempting to reconcile gaps too wide to close. Names, places, outcomes surface without context. The war feels both finished and unfinished at the same time. The sky returns overhead. It looks unchanged, but it no longer carries the same invitation. Its openness now contains memory, of exposure, of distance that could not be crossed, of the moment when control slipped beyond reach. Looking up does not prompt longing. It prompts caution. The body bears quiet evidence of endurance. Weight lost, strength reduced, reflexes dulled by stillness. Recovery begins immediately, but without a clear endpoint. Healing is not a process that can be scheduled. Leaving captivity does not restore what was taken. It alters the conditions again. Freedom introduces uncertainty of a different kind, one without boundaries to push against. The familiar structure of endurance dissolves, leaving space that must be navigated without instruction. Returning to life outside the war reveals a quiet divide. The world appears intact. Buildings stand. Routines continue. Conversations move forward without reference to absence or waiting. The gap between experience and environment becomes apparent immediately. Language falters. What was lived does not translate cleanly into description. The body remembers conditions the mind cannot easily explain. Confinement, stillness, the effort of holding oneself together over time. These memories resist narrative. They surface instead as sensation. Silence becomes habitual, not because there is nothing to say, but because speaking feels imprecise. The discipline of restraint persists beyond necessity, shaping behavior long after the environment has changed. The habit of conserving energy, of withholding reaction, of maintaining internal order remains intact. Flying, if it occurs again, does not feel the same. The aircraft remains familiar, but the relationship has shifted. Familiarity no longer guarantees comfort. The sky feels altered, not hostile, but revealing. Its openness now contains absence as much as possibility. Recognition may follow. Words may be spoken. Records adjusted. But these acknowledgments remain external. They do not resolve what has been internalized. Survival carries a cost that does not announce itself. It appears in caution where ease once existed, in patience where urgency might once have felt natural, in an awareness of limits that no longer feels restrictive, but clarifying. The war does not end cleanly. It recedes. What remains is distance, between who one was before the sky hardened and who returns afterward, between the world that continues and the memory that does not fade alongside it. This is not failure. It is consequence. After the noise fades, what remains is quiet, not the absence of sound, but the absence of demand. For Jefferson DeBlanc, the war does not end with noise or ceremony. The war recedes unevenly. It does not withdraw all at once. It loosens its grip in stages, releasing the body before the mind, restoring movement before meaning. The world resumes its pace without waiting for memory to catch up. For those who endured, survival does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as continuation. The habits learned under pressure persist. Attention stays narrow. Restraint remains automatic. The body still prepares for conditions that no longer exist, conserving energy, measuring risk, scanning for signals that never come. This vigilance is not fear. It is inheritance. The sky remains overhead, unchanged in appearance, but altered in significance. Its openness now contains reminders of distance that could not be crossed, of margins that disappeared without warning, of moments when control gave way to endurance. What once felt expansive now carries weight. Time moves forward, but memory does not follow obediently. It circles. It returns without announcement. Certain sensations, heat, vibration, confinement, waiting, surface unexpectedly, detached from context but intact in feeling. These are not recollections of events. They are residues of conditions. Recognition exists, but it settles lightly. Distinctions, tallies, acknowledgments arrive after the fact, assembled from fragments that once belonged to long hours in the sky. They offer structure, a way to name what happened, but they do not redefine it. In the air, numbers never mattered. On the ground, they explain very little. What mattered was continuity, the ability to return again and again, to maintain discipline across fatigue and uncertainty, to remain effective when conditions narrowed and choice collapsed. These qualities resist simple celebration. They do not seek attention. They persist quietly. Survival does not elevate. It alters. The person who returns carries forward a different sense of proportion. Risk is measured differently now. Silence has weight. Waiting is familiar. The world feels less stable, but more legible. The illusion of control has been replaced by something steadier, acceptance without resignation. This acceptance does not erase what was lost. It makes room for it. The Pacific continues its movement, indifferent as ever. It has absorbed countless stories without pause, carrying no record of those who crossed above it or disappeared into it. The sky, too, remains unchanged, wide, patient, offering no guarantees. What endures is not spectacle, but memory shaped by restraint. The machine that once carried a pilot through that space was never designed to impress. It was built to endure. In that endurance, a relationship formed, between discipline and survival, between restraint and continuity. That relationship outlasts the war itself. Years may pass. Life may resume its ordinary rhythms. But certain lessons remain embedded, no longer conscious, no longer questioned. They surface in moments of pressure, in choices made quietly, in the refusal to overreach when patience will suffice. This is not heroism preserved in amber. It is experience integrated into life. The war does not end with victory or defeat. It ends by dispersing itself into those who lived through it, reshaping how they move through the world long after the conditions that demanded adaptation have disappeared. What remains is not closure. It is orientation, a way of standing inside uncertainty without demanding resolution, a familiarity with limits that no longer feels restrictive, but clarifying, the knowledge that endurance is not dramatic, but deliberate, built through countless small decisions made correctly, without witness. This is where the story settles, not in triumph and not in loss, but in the quiet persistence of memory, carried forward flight by flight, day by day, long after the engine noise has faded. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.